competition for jobs becomes a struggle to survive. Two graduates fresh out of college seek employment in a city of 8 million people. Now entering the real world, the graduates become increasingly desperate and begin to question their college-trained talents. It's a time of hope and frustration for the workforce of the future. Faces of China at this time on Al Jazeera.
In a new series of one-hour documentaries, Al Jazeera English showcases films from across the Al Jazeera network.
They were fighters, assassins, insurgents, and icons. They took up arms to become an integral part of Lebanon's 15-year civil war. The war through the eyes of the women who fought on the front lines.
Al Jazeera World.
Day 13, and Egypt's uprising gets a new name. The Day of Martyrs is underway, but can protesters keep up the momentum? So protests continue as the Muslim Brotherhood, the country's largest opposition group, gets ready to meet with the Vice President. I'm Sami Zaidan. Also coming up on the program, the push to get life back to normal. Egypt's banks set to reopen. Renewed clashes in Tunisia as concern grows that change may only be skin deep. And flooding in Sri Lanka. Nearly 200,000 are homeless as more heavy rain hits the island nation. Well, it's now 9 o'clock in Cairo, and what's being called the Day of Martyrs has begun. More protests are expected in the capital's Liberation Square and right across the country. But there is also a concerted effort by the government to get things back to normal. Well, the banks have just reopened and people are trying to get back to work. Alan Fisher reports.
Tighter security around Liberation Square. The Egyptian government is trying to get the country back to work. Banks and businesses are planning to reopen, but the protesters are still there. It's been announced the country's largest opposition group, the Muslim Brotherhood, will meet the Vice President. This despite an earlier vow of no talks before President Mubarak's departure.
We gave the condition that aggression against our people stop. Tens of Egyptians were killed. We gave the condition that anybody who caused harm to the Egyptian people over the past 30 years will be taken to court. We gave the condition that peaceful demonstrations should be the right of all Egyptians. They accepted this.
The extent of the violence in other places in Egypt is now becoming clear. These pictures obtained by Al Jazeera show an attack by anti-government forces. The target, a police station, the location, Old Cairo on Friday. It's scenes like these which have prompted calls from Western leaders for immediate changes in the regime. But the under-pressure president received some unlikely support from a top American official. The man the US sent to Cairo to help solve the crisis said he wasn't sure Mubarak should go now.
President Mubarak's continued leadership is critical. It's his opportunity to write his own legacy. He's given 60 years of his life to the service of his country. This is an ideal moment for him to show the way forward.
The White House disowned the comments, saying they were private views. The Mubarak government is keen to show it's changing and it's business as usual. But the protesters still insist nothing changes until the country's leadership does. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera.
Well, tighter security is being imposed around Liberation Square. You're looking at live pictures coming out of the capital. The Egyptian government trying to get the country back to work today. Well, banks and businesses are now reopening, But the protesters are still there, as you can see. It's been announced the country's largest opposition group, the Muslim Brotherhood, will meet the vice president. This despite an earlier vow of no talks before President Mubarak's departure. Well, the extent of the violence in other places in Egypt is now becoming clear too. These pictures obtained by Al Jazeera show an attack by anti-government forces. The target, a police station, the location, Old Cairo on Friday. It's scenes like these which have prompted calls from Western leaders for immediate changes in the regime. But under the pressure, the president is receiving some unlikely support from a top American official. Let's go now to our correspondent who's in Liberation Square. I guess banks and businesses have now reopened. Does it look like the government strategy is working to get people off the streets and into offices?
Well, it is working to a certain point. For example, here in Liberation Square, there's one of the biggest government buildings in the whole of Egypt. It's a complex where people do all sorts of paperwork. And I was just down there now, and you could see protesters who were convincing actually the civil service to either to go home and take a week off, telling them, you know, the government is obliged to pay you no matter what you do because it's not your fault, or to convince them that actually to join the protest. And it was quite interesting to see that actually some of them thought, well, let me go in, see what you guys are talking about, and I'll try, and then I'll make my mind up. So certainly I think it is a day where the government is going to use all its might, which it still had, the state media, the institutions, to try to win people on their side, because to try to give them some sort of normalcy, access to money, which is extremely important after 13 days of an economy at a standstill. But you're also having here on Liberation Square the protesters very much aware of that. So at the moment you have the organizers who just announced a coalition of the revolutionary youth, and that means that all the different groups are now under that one banner, and they're trying to write some sort of statement that they will photocopy and give to business owners, for example, in the area whose life has been completely at a standstill for the past 13 days, and then they try to distribute it to wider Cairo to tell people, we know your life is difficult, but you have to understand that we're also fighting for you.
What, if anything, have you seen of measures imposed to kind of pressure protesters in Liberation Square to leave? We've heard things, or I've heard things about restricting supply of food, movement of people, the traffic organization to restrict the movement of people in Liberation Square. Have you seen anything like that?
No, actually, I've just been around Liberation Square. Yes, there has been that sort of pressure over the past few days, but I think it's a bit lighter, because now if you go around the square, there's little stalls selling cigarettes, selling tea, selling food. There is an organization going on. It's actually, I would call it an encampment that is becoming every day more efficient. Certainly yesterday, a senior commander of the army walked across the square, tried to convince people to leave, and they replied that they were not going to leave until President Mubarak actually leaves his post first. So yes, there has been attempts to have them leave, but I think also people are realizing, at least the government is realizing, that for the moment it would be a futile attempt unless something interesting is offered to the protesters. And for them, so far, all these moves you see, including yesterday's move to remove Safwat al-Sharif, for example, a man who is considered a henchman of President Mubarak, a man who is widely believed, even though it's not proven, to have actually instigated and organized the violence that happened this time and other times in the country. Even that kind of move is not enough. They call it cosmetic moves. They say that the whole problem came from the top because it's such a centralized government, and unless the man who actually gives all these orders is not removed, then nothing else can change.
The last time we spoke, you were just about to tell us about political parties sending people to talk with the demonstrators, try and come to a common position. Are there representatives kind of emerging to speak on behalf of the protesters in the square? Is some kind of organization now emerging?
Well, there are two organizations, I think, that are emerging. Well, first, the Organization for Change of Dr. El-Baradei, and then there's also something called the Wise Man, and that's also a sort of group of different kind of high-profile Egyptians. It includes Amr Moussa, the Secretary General of the Arab League, and it's not very clear what if he will still have a job after that, if he's getting involved into this. And Ahmed Zuhail, who is a Nobel Prize winner, and several other sort of high-profile ambassadors. Now, I think there is still no definite choice that has been made, but the groups are talking to these two kinds of people. They have offered to represent